There are new revelations regarding Dick Cheney and the CIA leak case. The explosive question tonight, why wasn't he prosecuted? New documents show that in an interview with federal investigators in May of 2004, Shooter answered, I don't recall, 72 times. 72 times. He kind of did it like Ollie North used to do it. You know what I mean? I can't recall. Several of those times directly contradicted sworn testimony by his former chief of staff, Scooter Libby. Joining me now with more on this is MSNBC's David Shuster, who was as thorough as anybody on the face of the earth covering this back when it was happening. David, you read this over the weekend. What were your impressions? How could Prosecutor Fitzgerald miss on this?
Well, and that's what's so shocking, Ed. I mean, it wasn't just that Cheney contradicted the sworn testimony of Scooter Libby, which was played at Scooter's trial. He also contradicted documents that Libby created. Cheney also contradicted people who were supposedly friendly witnesses to Cheney, like Kathy Martin, who was his press secretary, who testified that she went into Cheney's office to talk about Joe Wilson with Cheney and Scooter Libby. Cheney didn't remember any of that. And here's the most interesting sugar plum of all in this. And remember how Vice President Cheney would get these CIA briefings every morning. He would have somebody from the CIA who would give him an update on events around the world. Well, one of those briefers testified at trial. His name was Craig Schmall, and he testified about a time when Cheney asked for information about the Wilsons. So Schmall writes down notations on the documents. When Cheney was asked about this request of a CIA briefer, not only did Cheney say, I don't recognize these notations, I don't know why this guy wrote this down, but Cheney then trashes the guy by saying that this document, the notations, represent the CIA's attempt, and then it's redacted. In other words, it was going into Cheney making claims about the CIA somehow perhaps getting even, and prosecutors didn't feel that it was third party, so they didn't feel it needed to be in this report. But after all of this, after being briefed for so many years by a CIA briefer, the idea that Cheney would try to throw him under the bus and say this is all part of the CIA's effort to get even with him, it's nuts.
David, I've spoken to a number of people today who have written books on Dick Cheney. One of them, John Nichols of The Nation, he says if there's one thing about Dick Cheney, he does have a phenomenal memory. And it's an absolute joke that 72 times in an interview he said he couldn't recall. I'm just amazed that the federal prosecutor allowed this to slip the way it did, which I think average Americans out there are thinking this thing was cooked from the beginning, that Cheney was hands off.
That's right, and there's a standard sort of protocol within the Justice Department. It's followed by some prosecutors and not others, and that is if you're going to indict a high-profile politician, say a governor or a mayor or somebody, say, like the vice president, you have to have a very strong case. You just can't have the same standard for indicting that you have with other people. So clearly Prosecutor Patrick Fitzgerald was following this, but again, the irony is when you look at the Cheney interview, and remember the Cheney interview came, several months into the investigation, it was essentially Cheney had more holes in his testimony, Ed, than Scooter Libby. And remember, it was Scooter Libby was the one who got indicted and convicted. And so you can only presume, in talking to people who know Patrick Fitzgerald, he was extremely cautious. He was somehow hoping or maybe betting that Scooter Libby would eventually become a state's witness to avoid jail time. And there was one instance when they might have been close, and that is before Scooter Libby went to trial, we reported and others reported that Libby's friends had urged him, cut a deal with Fitzgerald, cut a deal, avoid the trial, say the truth about Vice President Cheney. Libby refused. Libby went to trial. He was convicted, but then his sentence was commuted, and the prosecutors lost whatever leverage they thought they might have had.
Well, it sounds like a cooked-up deal at this point. I guess you could say that Scooter Libby took one for the team. And this is all done now, right, David? I mean, this story is just going to go off into outer space, and it's all done. There's no recourse.
Yeah, other than the history books, which will look at this chapter and say Vice President Cheney couldn't recognize what his own handwriting implied in some of this, but he could remember some of the most excruciating little details about trips that he made the same day. I mean, that's what will go into history's judgment. But there's one other aspect, Ed, and that is there is a civil lawsuit that an ethics watchdog group has filed. So I suppose there's some potential there in terms of civil liability. But as far as a criminal investigation, it's long gone.
Personally, did you, as a reporter, knowing what you covered and how detailed, now that you read this, how did you feel?
I was surprised. I mean, it was so clear, Ed, in the Libby trial that Scooter Libby essentially talked with Vice President Cheney a lot about what strategy to pursue. And Libby tried to make the argument, and at times he was successful. He made the argument, look, we were just pushing back at a critic. Where Libby got tripped up was over his allegation about reporters. So you could make an argument if Cheney wanted to, hey, this guy was going after us. Of course I was talking with my chief of staff about trying to hit back and undermine him. The problem is that Cheney, for whatever reason, maybe he got spooked by the fact that a CIA agent was outed. He was so careful that he decided to go to the extreme and deny, to the extent that it's almost impossible to believe, to deny that he had any involvement with guiding Scooter Libby, that he could remember anything, that any of the documents were his own. He went to an extreme, and again, that's why it's so shocking when the evidence was there that he and Scooter Libby were joined at the hip on this. It's so shocking to see the tact that Cheney had with prosecutors, and it makes it even more shocking that prosecutors didn't pursue a criminal indictment against Cheney.
David Shuster, thanks so much tonight. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ed. Take care.